Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Erica Solbacher, and I am the director of the MGH Healthcare Transformation Lab. And I'd like to welcome you to the fall edition of our Novelline speaker series, where we have speakers both from within the hospital, but more often from outside, come to join us, have a cross-section of the hospital in the audience to hear about new approaches or perspectives and innovation. And I'm very pleased today to introduce Sara Holoubek, our speaker. Sara is the CEO and founder of Luminary Labs, a consultancy that develops strategies and innovation systems to help Fortune 500 government and nonprofit organizations thrive in the face of change. She is also an active early-stage investor. Sara holds a BA from the University of Iowa and an MBA from HEC in France. Sara is particularly passionate about the thorny problems that matter, such as stemming chronic disease, closing the skills gap, rethinking the future of work, and using data to make smart cities safer. Sara writes and speaks extensively on the intersection of technology, innovation, and humanity. She's been recognized by LinkedIn as a 2017 top voice in technology, recognized by Mashable as a female founder to watch, recognized by Smart CEO magazine as a 2017 New York Brava Award winner, and by PepsiCo Win for her contributions to women in technology. This morning, Sara will be speaking on the digital transformation of health, balancing speed, innovation, and ethics. So please join me in welcoming Sara Holoubek.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh, that's so nice. It rarely happens. I want you to imagine a deadly problem. It's one that takes over 40,000 lives every year and forever alters the quality of life of millions. It's also completely preventable. Now imagine you have a solution. It's new, but we've put about $80 billion into it. It could not only reduce those deaths dramatically, but it could also increase quality of life. We still don't know exactly where it is, despite all of that money being invested. If it were a drug, some people would say that it's still on the bench. Others might say that it's in the clinical trial phase. But we're not talking about a drug. We're talking about emerging technology. When it comes to therapeutics, the FDA has established the tolerable level of risk, a process for testing in labs and on humans, and the acceptable amount of human harm during the development of this thing. With technology such as artificial intelligence or autonomous vehicles, we have no agreed upon protocols while we're proving out this hypothesis that this new way will save lives. My day job is as CEO of Luminary Labs. And as Eric mentioned, we love the thorny problems that matter. And every single day we're answering questions like these. We worked with Merck to help them determine how voice-enabled technology like the Alexa might improve the quality of life or outcome of somebody living with diabetes. Can the blockchain help people who are victims of human trafficking have a greater voice? Can it surface this problem in the supply chains of goods and services? How can open and non-traditional data sets help our cities be safer? Can we use AR and VR to help students prepare for the jobs of the future? And for pharmaceuticals, we're often answering this question. Are you going to use data science to kill the pill or make the pill stronger? So when we think about digital therapeutics, what are we going to do? And so these thorny problems that are our strong suit also have required us to start thinking a little bit different about these same technologies. They hold great promise. But with these new technologies comes the responsibility of imagining unintended consequences. And in 2018, we are not short of stories to tell. Passive data collection is the holy grail for fitness trackers, right? This idea that I don't need to do anything, the device is just doing it. When I add a social function, I can share my data with others. And if I'm Strava and I decide to open up the data of all the people using my service, it makes some really great data visualization like this. Except this is a military base that was not intended to be disclosed. Data science has the power to do the math faster. It gets rid of that drudgery. And so often we joke about welcoming our algorithmic overlords. But what happens when the algorithm makes a decision that is not necessarily in the best interest of a human, such as this individual who lost health care? How many people here have some type of voice tech, voice assistant, Alexa, Siri? Raise your hand high. Okay. Is that thing always on or not? We still don't know. So conversational interfaces are really fascinating. I love the ability to reduce friction in our lives. We don't need the keyboard. That's a very antiquated way to sort of find anything. I have to think of a keyword and type it in. With voice, I can just say it. But is the thing always on? This is a case where a woman's conversations were actually recorded and then emailed to another party without her knowing about this. This makes for a very interesting edge case. So earlier this year, I published this article with MM&M. It's a trade magazine in the health field. And every year they ask me to write what they call the Game Changers edition. I get to pick the topic. And by late last year, I was pretty sure that ethics were going to be a big deal in 2018. And in particular, I had been doing some work in the digital biomarker space. So understanding how we swipe and tap and what we like and how that might be used to predict something about our health, right? Do I have a disease? Am I ripe for a clinical trial, et cetera? And I was a little concerned because I realized that none of this data is classified as health data. So what kind of precautions are we taking? So I was particularly interested in this search for digital biomarkers. I was also interested in the use of digital devices in clinical trials and studies. I was interested in this idea of research in the wild, looking at vast troves of Twitter, Facebook, Google data to try to surmise something about health, which seems to be a rather popular and obvious approach to understanding humanity. As Eric and I were just discussing, 2 billion people use Facebook on like a weekly basis. That's a lot of people. And so I wrote this piece, and in it I was able to interview individuals who worked at pharmaceuticals, who talked a lot about the current state of bioethics and then how they apply that to clinical trials. In that case, they say, we actually have a good framework, but what we really need to do is reduce the amount of data we collect. When consumer grade devices like your iPhone are now entering a clinical environment, they're collecting far more pieces of data than you really want to be responsible for. So that's the pharma's point of view. Another person, a researcher, said, hold on, if you have data that could save a life, how selfish are you to say that you wouldn't use that data? And she said, it really comes down to how sick you are. The more sick you are, the more likely it is that you're going to want to open up data. You say, take my data, take everyone's data, otherwise I will die. And yet another researcher said, yes, that's true, but we need to really rethink IRBs, right? So who are the people in the IRB who are reviewing packages? Are they educated on the intersection of data, technology, and humanity? On the other hand, do the researchers know how to put that together? I'm seeing people chuckle, right? On the other hand, are the people who are putting together these packages, are you really thinking about unintended consequences? And that individual, Camille Nebeker out of UCSD, has created this open source platform where you can submit your package and you can get feedback on how you're submitting something to an IRB. Her particular use case that prompted all of this happened years ago when she had a pervasive device that was going to take pictures during a study. Now, the participants had consented. They had signed off. Yes, I know I'm going to have this device. It's going to do X, Y, and Z. It's also going to take pictures. What was concerning to the IRB was that other individuals might be in those pictures. And if this device is pervasive, it's taking 30,000 pictures during the period of the study, how many people who did not consent to be part of the study are now kind of part of that study? And for that reason, she started the core at UCSD. And so the best quote out of this that I got was from Ray Patrick Lake out of Duke. And she said, Sara, today the problem is that on one hand, we have armchair philosophers, and on the other hand, we have lawyers. And we need a much better way going forward. So depending on the type of organization you work in, you either have an ethics council that sits back and pontificates from like with like a lapdog next to a fire, or you have a lawyer who's like, no, 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 and really no. And so we really need to think about this. How can we go forward? And is there a better way? And it's not going to be comfortable. So I published this article. I wrote it late last year, and it came out in March. And 2 days later, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica affair was exposed by The Guardian. That was a Friday night, if you recall. And the very next day was when we had the first Uber death. I don't know if you recall that. That was the day after Cambridge Analytica. And it occurred to me that we as a society do not yet have a common and shared framework to navigate the world we have programmed, right? The reactions to Facebook were like, wait, my data? Well, if you're a technologist, you know that your data is how they monetize everything, right? Like they're taking your data, but most people did not know that. And in the case of the Uber death, we have like swallowed this pill that autonomous vehicles are safer when in fact they haven't yet been deployed. It is a hypothesis. I would love for that hypothesis to be true, but we're still proving it out. And so I post on LinkedIn this like short thing about how we're not ready. And the rule whenever you post something is don't read the comments, right? You know this, like do not read the comments. But like I couldn't not read the comments. There were like a couple hundred comments by the time this thing was over. And so they range from everything from people who believe that there is no such thing as ethics in tech, that tech is a separate thing that cannot have ethics. Only humans can have ethics. And then you'd make the argument, well, humans make the tech. And then people say, well, no, then it's a legal issue. If you create something that kills somebody, then that's a legal issue. It's not there shouldn't be ethical considerations. Yeah, some of these are a little crazy town. Some person said that there's the fact that the woman was homeless should not be taken into account. That socioeconomic status is not important. Others would say, well, of course you should take into account socioeconomics and human factors. Some people say accidents are always going to happen. Why do you care about this one death compared to the 40,000 that die at the human hands? It's just fairly clear that like we are not in any type of agreement as a society. And from that day forward, I decided that I was going to be on a mission. I'm going to help the world be both pro-tech and pro-ethics. These are not mutually exclusive concepts. And so what I'm going to present to you today are 5 ways that you and your organization can build an ethical imagination, which is a phrase I've borrowed from a few other ethicists, so that you can avoid the unintended consequences. Now, the last time I gave a talk like this was only two and a half months ago. And in that interim, we have multiple more convenings, multiple more frameworks that I'm going to present to you today. This is happening on a daily basis. So if this is of interest to you, I highly recommend that you keep your ear to the ground and follow some of these organizations, because we are still at the earliest stages of understanding how we're going to create these frameworks that we adhere to, whether we are physicians, hospital administrators, corporations, or academic institutions, or citizens at large. This one's easy. Read more science fiction. So in an interview with the New York Times, Mark Zuckerberg said, when I was in my college dorm, there's no way I could have imagined my platform being used to interfere with an election. Well, one, he's not in a college dorm anymore, and he has a lot of smart adults around him. And so when I read that, I was sort of laughed. And I said, how can you not imagine that? That's just ridiculous. And in my office, we were chatting about that the next morning, and people started talking about stories they had read or movies. And so we decided that we were going to curate a list. And so of science fiction, because a few days later after that article came out, Facebook launched the dating service, or announced that they were going to have the dating service that is part of Facebook, which I'm not quite familiar with. But this science fiction writer says, I can't think of anything more foolish than to put Mark Zuckerberg in charge of my personal life. So but anyway, in that spirit, we put together, we actually curated 100 works of fiction that help you understand unintended consequences. We curated 40. You can read this. This is on Quartz. It's also on our website. Here's a long list. You can't read them, but it's everything from The Matrix to The Jetsons to Wall-E and Tron to Dune, 1984, 2001: A Space Odyssey. All of these works of fiction push the imagination into directions both positive and negative as to what technology might be able to do for us. And I know you're all very busy people, and especially for those of you who are practicing or in this room at all, the cheat sheet, like the Cliff Notes, like grab your kids and go watch these movies. So this is the Omnidroid from The Incredibles. If you recall, this was a self-learning machine that would kill superheroes so it could then eventually get smart enough to kill Mr. Incredible himself, which did not succeed. But like if a child can understand this, so can Mark Zuckerberg. And then of course WALL-E, which these movies are really quite old, the first ones. If you go back, these were long before Facebook even existed, and they were in development for years and years because of the animation. People have been thinking about the unintended consequences of technology for quite some time. They just don't work in Silicon Valley. But sci-fi, maybe they should, right? Sci-fi and speculative fiction aren't really just for entertainment. Lowe's has this innovation lab, and ASU Center for Science and the Imagination. They make use of what they call speculative fiction, and they employ science fiction writers to help them understand unintended consequences or the future of technology and humans. So this is an actual function within an organization that's thinking about the future. So number 1, read more fiction. 2, get to know the tech ethicists. Now, I was fortunate through researching that article that I was able to intersect with a number of people that I would not have previously met. Many of them are academics, and so maybe they sit in their academic circles. But if you try a little bit harder, you'll start to find them, and they're starting to publish. To make it easier for you on Twitter, I made a list, and I'm adding to it every day. I'm also taking suggestions. Camille Nebeker from the Core is the one on the upper left. Ifoma Njunwa, also affiliated with Harvard as well, and Cornell. She was a judge on the Alexa Diabetes Challenge we ran. So when we were looking for concept car solutions using voice-enabled technology to improve the experience of somebody with diabetes, it occurred to us that one of our judges needed to have a background in surveillance and ethics, and health data in particular. So we actually integrated an academic into a commercial program to make sure we were being honest with ourselves. DJ Patil was the first chief data officer of the United States of America. I'm going to mention him a little bit later. He's a huge proponent. Definitely follow him. Tristan Harris used to work at Google, and he's now one of the most ardent, vocal advocates for, maybe reducing our reliance on technology. So the same people who built the technology, there's this wave of technologists saying, like, don't use the stuff we built. I feel terrible, but, like, don't do it. It's a very cathartic experience, I'm sure. Laura Noren was at NYU teaching data ethics and now is at a cybersecurity firm, and so on and so forth. And you can meet all these people through the Twitter list. Another great way to find ethicists, tech ethicists in particular, is there is an individual here, Corey, out of Boulder. She created it's a Google Doc, and I can send all these links to you if you're interested. It's a Google Doc of all the tech ethics courses that she is aware of, and other people submit to it. So there has been this call for ethics courses to be reintegrated into like really any undergraduate program that touches technology. So it used to be that ethics were something that lived in the humanities. As we, as a country, decided that STEM was more important than humanities, we sort of engineered out critical thinking and all that other stuff that comes with ethics. And so now there's this big push to bring it back in. So you're going to see this big wave. I would love to see that, in medical school. Obviously, like there's all sorts of different ethical frameworks that you go through. If you work at a pharmaceutical, you have to go through pharmacovigilance training. But now we need to take a step back and understand what those frameworks mean in the digital age. So you can contribute to this if you know of a course, but you can also peruse it. And then obviously you'll see the readings and you'll see the people teaching them. Another organization is called .Everyone. This is a Google Doc. I literally screenshot the Google Doc. It is this massive, massive index of like all ethical tech initiatives. So you could go visit that as well. So number 2, get to know the tech ethicists. Again, I'm going to go back to that original post that I put up on LinkedIn. There are a lot of people who talk very loud, a lot of squeaky wheels. The tech ethicists are a little bit, like they've been doing this for so long. So just pay attention to, the signal versus noise. So the next thing, this is really popular in 2018, is to take or create an oath around ethics. And so DJ Patil, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, was the first, and he created a code of ethics for data scientists, and he asked for people to come together to collect case studies and to create this together. You'll notice it's really no coincidence, but most people are drawing on the Hippocratic Oath. If we're going to agree to not do harm in health and medicine, like why should it be any different with technology, especially when we're seeing the negative outcomes that can be associated with technology. And so we have the chief of staff for Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, for example. The designer's oath, which is very well designed. If you download their, it's really beautiful. Everybody else is a little bit more scrappy. But they actually have a tool. They have example oaths. They have things like that. So if you're designing a service, and this was very explicitly for people in the health tech field, it's not just about the developer designing the thing. It's the design of the interface. It's the business model, et cetera. So these are popping up left and right. If you just Google like tech oaths, you will find one for you, or you can create one. And there is a sort of an initiative around getting companies to create what are your core values and what do you promise to do as an organization. So now this is the big one, which is like, okay, oaths are great and getting to know people are great and science fiction are great, but like, what do you actually do? And this is all brand new. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. But there are a number of frameworks that are designed to spur the ethical imagination. That means explicitly, before you do the thing, how can you imagine what could go wrong so you can redesign the thing to not do that? So this one's pretty new. It's like a month old. Ethical OS. It was funded by the Omidyar Foundation. So Pierre Omidyar founded eBay, and he has a very large foundation that's squarely focused on like the betterment of humanity. And it was created in partnership for the Institute for the Future. It is a toolkit and it has a checklist. Okay, so you can download both of these. And it looks something like this. They've identified 8 risk zones. So the first one is fake news. That's shorthand for truth, disinformation, and propaganda, which I think we, not just in America, but really around the world, our media channels, especially through social media, are really easily gamed, right? The second is addiction. So Tristan Harris, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, and the Center for Humane Technology are very much focused on how do we move away from a technology that's designed for us to never put the phone down. And they make this argument that the monetization of social networks is explicitly designed to do just that, and that we are actually altering the brains of children, that we are causing depression in adults. We saw this really crazy article the other day about the Instagram effect and people going to plastic surgeons wanting to look like what Instagram filters make you look like. And so when you think of the health ramifications of that addiction, not only is it the inability to concentrate or get things done or be productive in your life, maybe depression, maybe other social issues, we are actually altering what we think a real human looks like. The third is economic and asset inequalities. And so again, through the monetization or the business model of technology, are you explicitly creating inequities? One could argue that the gig economy is like the prime example of this. So you can use the gig economy to get more done for less, but what are you doing to all those individuals who no longer have health care, right? There are a few companies. One is called Hello Alfred. Another is managed by Q. They're both gig economy companies that very intentionally design their system to lift people up versus push them down. So it is an ethical choice. You can do the gig economy and employ it in your company without necessarily pushing people down. The fourth is machine ethics and algorithmic bias. This is a huge one. Gender, racial, religious, any discrimination you can imagine. Like AI is all about pattern detection, but how you feed the machine is as important as the machine itself. And right now, we're teaching the machine. And so if we're teaching the machine with data sets, training data that is already biased, there's this, I should have included this, there's an article a couple of days ago that noted that not only are you propagating the same bias, there is some evidence that you're actually making it worse. Okay, because then the machine's going to override anything that humans say, and we will actually create more inequity through bad AI. Anyone who actually works in AI will tell you that this is absolutely true. People who don't work in AI have only seen the fancy Wired articles about how amazing it's going to be, think that it's perfect. Surveillance, so privacy concerns. What are the rights of individuals? Data control and monetization, right? So you use Facebook for free, but you give them everything. Is that right? At what point should you be given something back? Is the thing you get back of the same utility as the monetization of your data? Implicit trust and user understanding. Do you even know that this is happening, right? And so, one lawyer said to me, when terms and conditions are the new informed consent, where does that leave us? So if you think about like any app today, whether it's intended for a health use or not, if its data is going to be used for some type of health study at some point, how many of you read T's and C's when you're like, yeah, I love that app and I'm doing this and I'm configuring all that? Like, nobody reads the T's and C's. And if buried deep within is the like, by the way, your data might be ported over to somebody else. Or in the case of Facebook, that like some other party will use it. The Cambridge Analytica affair was not a leak. People think it is a leak. That was an intentional part of their business model that they changed a few years ago. There's a period of time where they said, yes, anyone can really use this data. It wasn't illegal. Had pretty nefarious effects. Hateful and criminal actors, if you build it, like they will game it, right? So like, are we building something so that it will prevent criminal acts or hate crimes? And so these risks, though, they go into each of these. And so when we talk about ethics, one of the things that I find interesting is that there are a lot of people who are concerned about bias. There are some people who are concerned about the addiction and dopamine economy, maybe the trust and the monetization, but very rarely do we see people really looking at all of these together. And so when you think about those ethical frameworks and unintended consequences, it is not sufficient to just say, like, we're just looking at risk zone 4. We have to look at them all. And this is particularly true of any technology that is going to be used in a health setting, or even if it's not a health piece of technology like Twitter or Facebook, if that data is going to be used for some type of health research, we need to take that into account as well. Another really great framework, this is hot off the presses, I think it was published like this week or last week, from DJ Patil as well as Hilary Mason, so two of our country's like foremost data scientists. He actually coined the term data science, I believe. They've been releasing chapters of this book through O'Reilly, and it is now fully available for download, and it is going to be free and open source forever. The Wall Street Journal called the early chapters like what your CEO is reading. So we're moving from ethics being this like vague term of like, well, it's nice if somebody thinks about that, to how do you operationalize it? And I think that's the key word, operationalizing ethics in the workflow, in the system. I love these questions that he wrote down. What if we asked about ethics in the interview around cultural fit when you're hiring a developer? Isn't that amazing? Like, you want to know what their chops are. What do you code in? Like, how big was your team? How do you think about ethics? What if every technology candidate asked the organization it was interviewing with about their ethical stance? This is a desired future state. And he talks about frameworks like the 5 C's. He has checklists, et cetera, in this book. And again, it is free. Another one, this is and for data scientists as well. It's like this command line tool that you just add ethical checklist to your data science project. This one I came across very recently. It's out of Switzerland. It was produced in conjunction with DataKind, which is a nonprofit. And it's called the Health Data Ethics Map. And this is really small to read, but you can see these different actors like researcher, institution, public. And as you go in, you can see the relationships. And so the intent of this, I believe, is to get people to understand the relationships between different parties. So when you're thinking about data ethics, it's not just about like the end consumer or the patient, or it's not just the physician, or it's not just the company, but that we are all interconnected. There are also workshops. So this is one that I facilitated with Natalie Evan Harris, the CEO of Bright Hive at Personal Democracy Forum. We created use cases. There are 4 or 5 of us that said, okay, I have a problem. I'm going to give an example. I used the voice tech Alexa Diabetes Challenge. I said, if I could do that over, what are how do you answer these questions? So if you were going to deploy a voice-enabled solution for somebody living with diabetes, what are all the activities for each stage of the data life cycle? Okay, so like write out those activities. Then to improve the ethical practice, what are the challenges and questions you can ask at each stage? Do you see misalignment in what you do day to day and your relationship to the data? That's the big part, right? So like data scientists or the programmers building something, and then business asks you to do something different, and then you go and you change it, and nobody goes back to say, yeah, but if we do that, we are exposing people to X, Y, and Z, or we are not protecting the privacy of that person, or these people will be excluded. And as Ifoma and Juno would say, if you exclude 10% of the people in the development of a product or service, that's pretty bad. If those 10% all belong to the same group, same skin color, same language, same gender, that's really bad. Don't do that. Okay? And so when business and technology don't align, that's when we sometimes see these things go off the rails. When you think about your own work, like what could you do tomorrow? Like what's the one thing you could do tomorrow to put a more sort of like ethical framework in place, right? That you could change. And then who are the 2 to 3 people in your organization that you could share this with, right? And so after we go, she has, I believe that's also open source. You can look at the framework and the exercise and go through the case study yourself and contribute to it. But then afterwards, ask yourself these questions. And the last thing that I recommend is join the community. So this is a growing community. It's nascent. Like we're all just finding each other, like these Twitter lists and these Google Docs and Medium posts and open source art. Like this is all happening in the last 6 months. People have been working on this for a while, but mostly in silos. So there are a number of convenings. In October, I'm speaking at this All Tech is Human. It's on a Saturday in New York at ThoughtWorks. It's produced by David Ryan Polgar, who's one of the earlier, more vocal writers about health or about ethics in tech in general. And there are a number of people, everybody from the author like Doug Rushkoff to people like me, people who are working in different industries. In San Francisco a little bit later in October, this event wants to be the largest ethical tech convening in Silicon Valley. And so that one's available. And then in January, Everyone, the folks who created that massive Google Doc index, are creating the responsible tech convening. It's the new normal. And so all of this is brand new. Every single day there's a new convening, there's a new event, there's a meetup, there are new lists, there are new frameworks. My guess is there are probably people in Boston who are doing things like this. And if they're not, you should do doing it. There also, if you can't get to an event, there are online resources. So Core, this is the platform I mentioned from Camille Nebeker. So research that involves a pervasive sensing of any kind. So it's like mobile imaging, sensing kind of technology. You can join the Core. You can contribute to the Core. You can also just peruse the Core. They've got this forum and the library. The Center for Humane Tech, that's the organization that was founded by the former Facebook and Google executives. They have like a community of people who believe that products should be designed for everybody and not just for monetization. And so you can go, they have a designers section, but they also have other ways to get involved. And then there are like Slack channels. So if you're a Slack person, I have a love-hate relationship with Slack, but they have an ethical workspace on content. So keep in mind that ethics in tech is not just limited to like an app. It's not just limited to like machine learning and AI. It can be the content you produce and that you publish, right? And so that was an interesting one that called me out. And there are many, many other Slack channels, like Data for Democracy has a pretty strong ethics cohort, is very active, and so on and so forth. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with some words from DJ Patil. So when he published this book, he produced all these stickers, which are really, if you're familiar with Zuckerberg and Facebook's earlier motto, which I believe they've put on the back shelf, which was move fast and break things. Now he's asking us to move purposely and fix things. So with that, I'm going to close and take questions.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was very provocative and very humbling, because I think we know that we know so little and we've got a long way to go, but hopefully with guidance like this, it will help us as we build things and think about applying digital solutions to healthcare. But love to, got a lot of time, so open the floor up to questions.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Sara. I really like the
Hi.
I like the frameworks that you actually presented and the 8 zone of risks. And I was wondering how all of that could play in the context of improved healthcare delivery and healthcare leadership, specifically when addressing the issue of medical error. In 1999, the National Academy of Sciences published a report noting that medical error was the leading cause of death in the U.S., leading up to 98,000 people. 2 years ago, researchers at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine updated the report, and they actually published that the actual count was between 250,000 and 400 deaths of people in the U.S. So those numbers are big, and they really remind us how inefficient healthcare in the U.S. is. and also how much of an under-recognized epidemic patient deaths because of medical error is. So how could we all help?
I mean, this is really interesting because I typically I'm speaking I'm not usually speaking to medical professionals. I'm speaking to people who are building devices or technologies to make sure that they are not going to, commit the same areas that we're trying to avoid in medical practice. But I think that's a really good point, right? And so, and this is precisely why we live between armchair philosophers and lawyers. So medical error is the thing that like nobody really wants to talk about, right? And moving individual behaviors and moving behaviors of large systems is a very, very hard task. I do think that in this new age of digital ethics, I think that the tech industry can actually learn something from health, because I think that there are frameworks that could be utilized in health. But I also think that we should do some little double loop learning where health should also take a cue of like how other industries are looking at it. So I think health has unfortunately gone down the path of lawyers, do everything possible so that you don't get blamed, right? Which doesn't really solve the real problem. So it could be interesting if we look at this. This is intended for tech, and I would say, this is one where, I would say bias. We see a lot of deaths because something was presumed to be true that was not. Like you hear about the woman who was left in the waiting room and everyone just ignored her, right? So biases about how sick somebody is based on the color of their skin, which is very well documented, right? That certain people perceive pain less. And so I think this is something where we can learn from each other. I would say, yeah, that's probably the one. I'd be open to other ideas, and then the economic and asset inequalities. Is there something somebody else would add on that? You guys are the experts there. Yeah, Nikhil.
I'm not an expert, but clearly the addiction risk is a big deal in healthcare. But if I may, I'd like to pick on another topic you raised, which is really important, which is the intersection between business, technology, and ethics. And so the question is there a survivorship bias in the examples that you're looking at because they picked eyeballs over ethics? And so when as a technologist, you ask the question, your business leader tells you it's a means to an end, and we can fix the ethics if we survive, but we can't survive if we don't get users.
Yeah, that's a good question. My interest in this topic started a few years ago, so I'm going to take a little trip back in memory lane. 4 or 5 years ago, one of my employees suffered a late-term miscarriage. She was carrying twins at 6 months and lost them. And I run a small business, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, obviously, I was like, take care of yourself, do whatever you need. And but I was Googling, like, do I offer maternity leave? What do I do? What's the right thing to do? Everything online said, call your lawyer. And I was like, I'm not calling my lawyer. And I'm not venture-backed. And so, like, if I said, you take as much time as you want. Okay, there's a risk. Like, she could take forever, right? Or whatever. I don't know. If this is set a precedent. She came back in a month. And it was around that time that and by the way, I forgot to mention, she was helping me write the Startup's Guide to Family Leave. And so I wasn't right. It's so unfortunate. And she comes back and I'm like, okay, we're not going to work on that. So we started working on what we call the Human Company Playbook. And so we spent a year or two, this was a side project of mine, just curating examples of small businesses who were making decisions that looked very different from the ones that I experienced when I worked in venture-backed companies. And so as it turned out, there's like this next generation of leader. They are doing things like offering 100% coverage of healthcare. And if you ask them, you say, like, what are your VCs saying? Because, like, when I worked in that industry, like, we were told to, like, pinch pennies. She's like, they never asked. And I was like, that's interesting, right? So there is a new mindset. It's things like family leave. It's willing to take we know we're going to be less profitable if we offer this thing. And so, so through the Human Company Playbook, we started to research large companies. We started to see things like Aetna increasing minimum wage to $16. And when Mark Benioff did that, he made a very explicit statement to the street that by increasing the wage, he was going to reduce turnover and improve customer satisfaction. He's making an economic argument to invest in humans. And so the Human Company Playbook, which is online, you can just go to the website, the Human Company Playbook, talks about how we design businesses. And so I was interested in, like, when United had that incident where the individual was dragged off the plane, everyone was pointing fingers, but that was a business design decision. Somebody at some point said, like, if people don't do this, they're gonna get dragged off by this subcontractor. I don't care who did the dragging, and somebody in that system did not think about that process. And so my earliest concerns about ethics, right before I wrote this article, it was like last year, I looked at the United affair, I looked at Uber, and like, I mean, I don't even know how many scandals they've had now, but you can oust your CEO and you can shake up the board, but what has fundamentally changed? And so, I'm very concerned about business design, and I do believe that there is a way to design a business that lifts humans up instead of pushes them down. And so we curated examples, and I think like the ones I mentioned, Managed by Q and Hello Alfred are good examples. The Muse is another one, and none of them are perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect organization, and in a world where we work with labor economics, right, like wage labor, wage economics, like you're doing a job, I'm paying you money, but you can decide how much profit you take, and you can decide what you give. And that's I did my MBA in France, as you know, so like a little bit of the socialist in me. I always call it the socialist MBA because the case study is different than in the US. Like you can't close the factory in France, but it's possible, and it is happening in America. So I think I would argue that if you're thinking that you'll figure out ethics later, it's too late. The trade, like that's how like the United situation happens, because that's so far down the chain. It has to start at the top. And I do think there's a future where, when we're looking at the makeup of boards, one of the reasons you want more diverse boards is to have more lived experiences. And if nobody at the board level is thinking about what could happen, why should your CEO care? Yes?
And thanks for outlining a really important discussion. I wanted to ask you, I liked your reference to sort of a Hippocratic Oath test. And as a physician, I guess I want to ask you, healthcare is very imperfect, and the healthcare system is very imperfect, but this Hippocratic Oath and ultimately sort of a mission and what comes down to an individual accountability between individuals and the patients that they care for, that is sort of the safety net for the entire system. So there's lots of bad actors in many levels in healthcare, but when it comes down to it, somebody feels this overwhelming responsibility and this accountability to the end consumer. And so in tech, I think, where's that layer of ultimate accountability, and is there a common mission that you can sort of put on tech like you can in healthcare that sort of directs the discussion? Because it's hard to see that in tech, if we sort of generically label it, that there is a common mission outside of sort of the economic motives of building a company. And I think that underlies some of what we see, not just in the modern world of tech, but going back to business, that people figure out the problems maybe too late. There are, as you just said, there are already many examples of things gone awry, and some of that is related to where the ultimate accountability is, and particularly in the social media sphere where there is an end consumer, that you can make an analogy to a patient even. And, the patient doesn't know all of the things you're doing for them, but there's an underlying trust that what you're doing is with the correct mission, and that has somehow been breached in tech. And I just wanted to sort of pick your brain.
Well, I think it's a great comment. I don't think that we're there yet. There are groups, Tech for Good, civic tech communities that are building tech, for all, but they're few and far between. I think the challenge is that for far too long, Silicon Valley and its investors really only cared about, we talk about growth hacking, that's the thing. It basically means get as many users as possible. You do use any tactic you can. If you haven't, I encourage you to read the New Yorker article from last week about Mark Zuckerberg. It talks about they had this, at one point they plateaued, so they created a growth team that they could get as many engineers as they wanted to grow the base, right? And at some point, like this one person commented, at some point you start to resort to tactics that aren't really on the up and up. right? And so it really is, if it really is about growth, and when we condition, I believe fundamentally that when we condition investors and therefore the street for growth and not value, like, we go terribly wrong. And unfortunately, that's the system that we sort of chose in the 70s and 80s. So when you think about any corporation, even if a CEO wants to do right, the board is going to punish that person for not getting the return that they're expecting. And so we're, as American, economy, I think we're very short-sighted in that we want to create short-term gain without realizing what the long-term losses might be. So I'll give you a couple examples. Right now, like the inequality gap, like right now it's massive. It's been growing. I think it reversed a little bit, but we're still talking about, like, if you're wealthy, you're incredibly wealthy. If you're poor, you're incredibly poor. The wealth gap is also very, very large, right? Like most Americans, I think it's like half of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. And this is by business design, right? And so all economic institutions are designed to do this. And when we do that, at some point, nobody will be able to afford your product. This doesn't actually make long-term business sense. But also, we're all going to pay for the negative health, education, and financial outcomes, right? Through taxes or some other sort of system, right? So I personally blame short-term thinking in our current capitalist situation. I am a capitalist, I'm an entrepreneur, and I do think that there's a better way. I do think that tech needs to ask itself, and that's really what the Center for Humane Technology is all about, is like, we have got to stop building for eyeballs and growth at all costs, and we need to rethink why we're doing this. So like the common mission they'll tell you is like, well, we're here to connect the world, right? Isn't that great? We're connecting the world. But when you connect the world, what happens when misinformation gets disseminated through that connected platform, right? So connecting it in a way that is respectful of humans, right? And of, the thing that came before the technology did. And doesn't cause more harm. So, I think you hit the nail on the head, yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the front and then the back, yeah.
Thank you for your talk, and I'm going to build on the top of accountability. And it seems like a lot of the topics we cover here is how we interact and how we behave in situations when these risks arise. And for me, a lot of points when human behavior changes is when there is a punishment, a legislation, if you will, to change behavior. For example, around self-referral, Stark laws was a good example around how we saw bad actors, you put in a law to try to circumvent that, or to block that rather. And so I wanted to ask, where do you see your role in terms of government?
Yeah.
And this, because it seems like right now it's kind of the Wild West, and it's kind of a self-regulation situation, and I don't see that usually going well for corporations or people. So.
Yeah, it's super Wild West. It's crazy. I heard this story when I was interviewing people for this article. There was a time where if you went to Google and you're like, I'm going to use all your data to come up with some health study, they're like, that's great, go use it. And if you talk to Verily, they're like, nope, it's health data. It's the same data. It's like, right? So I think there's sort of, it is Wild West. I think most tech ethicists will tell you that they want legislation of some kind. They don't believe that our legislators are well informed enough to make the right legislation, which is a really big argument for electing people who understand technology. And that was Brian Ford, who was, he helped create the Presidential Innovation Fellows program under Obama. He ran for Congress. He unfortunately lost, but he's a big proponent of, helping people elect people who understand technology, because you don't want the wrong people regulating technology, right? Like we see how that goes as well. But I think most people do expect that we will have legislation. It's probably 5-10 years out. Yeah, okay, in the back, and then I saw something over here, so yes.
I loved your comment on the terms and conditions, kind of how no one raises
Yes.
the best. I feel like that's kind of across the board, like in healthcare, I kind of sometimes see that too. You give people forms and they're just like, yeah, I'll sign the bottom, here we go. Is there a discussion kind of about trying to overcome that? Because I feel like that's a big problem, is people don't read something when it's more than a page, they'll read a paragraph.
Yeah. Yes, okay, so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I believe, is funding a convening or a discussion on informed consent in tech. They are primarily concerned about low income, low literacy populations who are particularly susceptible to like, check this. But I would encourage, I mean, these are things that like in your own institutions that you should be raising and doing. Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, it's Carlos in the back who actually had the opening quote in my article. Hi Carlos, how are you?
I missed the
He's the
first
expert.
minute.
That's okay. Yeah.
Great presentation, Sarah. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight one point that you said around sort of business models. And I think so much of our notion of what is right and what is wrong is the result of how people make money. And I think there's sometimes a lack of transparency in terms of like, well, how does this company actually make money? And I think sometimes there's sort of a social contract that's sort of broken when you find out sort of the realities of it. And I think, back when I was at patients like me, we kind of had this mantra, which is like you always come back to the patient and you tell them, what happened, how it happened. And I was just kind of curious to get your take on, what are some of the ways in which we could kind of collectively have these hard discussions around, what is ethical, what is not, and whether
Yeah.
ethical breaches, like, I think it's a point number or implicit trust in user
Right.
That's really hard to balance, like innovation, pushing the boundary with non-traditional data, but then also sort of having to take a step back and say, this is how we did it, this is what went wrong. So like, what do you see
Yeah.
emerging as like best practices?
Well, humility. I mean, that's amazing. And then, that's a really great comparison between the tech industry and the medical industry. For many years, like, you were not supposed to ever admit doing wrong. And I'd read a study that apparently, like, if physicians did admit doing wrong, they were actually less likely to get sued. But like, your institution isn't right. You guys are nodding. That's true. Okay, yeah. And so I think in the tech industry, what was most appalling by like the Zuckerberg and Sandberg, comments on Capitol Hill was that like they kind of pretended like they hadn't done anything wrong. That it wasn't a breach. It was, again, their business model. And so I think humility will go a long way. I think that understanding what your company's mission is, and many public companies, I mean, it was Coca-Cola, they had made their mission like shareholder value. That's the mission. Like, we exist to create shareholder value. And so I think you see people who are focused on what they'll call like triple bottom line. Like, there is this next era of social responsibility, which is really about like the ethical ramifications of how you design, develop, or produce and sell a product, right? And the inputs that go into it. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, that's a sort of a business school topic that, as much as I want to see ethics in tech courses, data science courses, I'm equally interested in business ethics here, yes.
So kind of, I wanted to flip this on its head, right? So we're focusing right now on a very select group of people, the 10%, the business owners, the businesses. But as you said, companies live and die by the user, right? I personally do not think that they will change just because we think they should, right? In the end, it comes down to money. So how can you actually affect the change from the bottom up instead of focusing at the top? They have no reason to change. They're doing great. For example, Facebook was, the data breach, not the data breach, but the Cambridge Analytica at Facebook. People went nuts over it. But a few months ago, Equifax was breached, which half of American data was stolen. I saw nothing about it. Absolutely nothing.
You can't do anything about that one.
Well, you can, actually, but nobody talked about it. Absolutely nobody. And I think it's a lack of education, understanding, because I know that Facebook uses my stuff for everything. Does my dad and mom? Probably not. The majority of people don't. So how do you actually disseminate this info to the majority of people so they can make an educated decision, which will affect these companies? Because if their business model is to sell your stuff, and the majority of people know that, they're not going to use your platform. So how do you actually get the, how do you get all this ethics talk down to everybody else? Because the people up top, they might never change. They might not care because of money.
Yeah, the Center for Humane Technology will say stop using the thing. So you should delete your account. That's what they will say.
Right.
Which is unfortunate because, like, on one hand, there's a reason we use it, because we do derive utility. We just want it to be, we want decisions to be made in a different way. about privacy or whatever it is that you are concerned about.
Mhm.
And the Equifax situation is interesting because there are a lot of things that like you might not be able to, I mean, you can't control whether Equifax is a requirement for like a mortgage or something like that, whereas like Facebook you can decide. So they actually have a checklist of things you can do, and some of them are very basic, like how to turn off notifications. So turn off like after the Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing, I went through the list and I was like, oh my God, how did I connect? So like I don't use Facebook as my primary like single login anymore. I went back to like email. And then I was mortified by like how many things I had looked at, and as sort of like somebody in technology, I test a lot of things, and I was like, oh my gosh, and so they have a checklist, the Center for Humane Technology, you can look at. I do think that there's sort of like this idea of popular uprising and demanding change. So some of the people who work at Google have asked Google to not work with particular parts of the government. Because they find what they're doing to be unethical. They do not want to be technology that could potentially be used for harm. IBM, there was this scathing article about facial recognition a day or two ago that like on the surface is like, oh yeah, it's really great if we can actually narrow down the type of person, exactly what they look like, but again, how you feed the machine, the bias that could come out of that. And the article, they also point out that IBM was a critical actor during the Holocaust. Their technology was utilized. So we have precedent for this. So there's worker uprisings. I think we're seeing letters. Somebody circulated a petition. Do not, as an angel investor, do not invest in companies that do business with X, Y, and Z, or on these subjects. So I think this is a very interesting political time we're living in, and the power of collective voices has been. I think it's sort of research. Like it used to be like when I was growing up, I remember people saying like, no, you can't really do anything. But I think we've seen people come together and create movements. But so I would say they're like delete the app, turn off notifications, or it is you have to band together and become large enough of a group that, to Carlos's point and other points that, they can see that unless you change, the dollars will flow differently.
But are any of these ethicists actually focusing on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. So like that petition that I was asked to sign, a lot of the technology companies, there are workers within that are petitioning their CEO to not work on particular initiatives. Specific to like ISIS. I think we're running out of time.
I hate to cut off a great
Yeah,
conversation. I know a lot of
I-
people have to go for 9 o'clock clinics and stuff, but Sarah would be
I'm
happy
here
to
for-
take some questions
Yep,
down here.
absolutely.
If you'd like to join us down here. So Sarah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you all for coming.